On this week's episode of the Macworld Podcast, it's all about your hot takes. You have thoughts about WWDC 25, Apple's new UI design, and more. It's going to be a good one, so stick around. Welcome to the Macworld Podcast. I'm Roman Loyola here with David Price.
Hello.
And Karen Haslam.
Hi.
This episode is all about social media hot takes. You have thoughts, and we're going to share and respond to what you wrote. All the comments mentioned in the show can be seen in the show notes for this podcast on macworld.com. And before we get started, as usual, I'd like to apologize ahead of time for completely butchering the commenter handles and reader names. But anyways, let's get started. 2 weeks ago at WWDC 25, Apple unveiled the UI changes it will make in its operating systems, which of course generated a lot of thoughts online. Some of the changes people like, others they aren't so sure. New and Green on Threads said, "It's great, don't worry about it, it looks spot on, it works fine, and this is a dev beta," which I guess meaning it's a dev beta, they can make changes. Zen Kayasuke on Facebook said, LMAO, took 18 years before Apple updated their iOS look to look like Windows Vista. Apple is really behind. Dr. Hooligan on Blue Sky said, "I'm finding all the preview images of liquid glass kind of hard to read. Not sure if it's astigmatism or if it's an ADA violation." Bill Davis 2439 on YouTube said, "Liquid ass sums it up." I got a couple more here. One word on TikTok said, "To those who fear the change, fear is the mind killer." To Onistico on Blue Skies, who in response to whether we'll like iOS 26 or not, they said, "We will not." So do you guys have any strong opinions on liquid glass?
Well, there are a lot of things there. I suppose we could start off with Windows Vista. Well, you could say, is Windows Vista Aqua? You know, who copied who? How far back do you need to go to find the original? I think, yeah, I mean, you could probably say that liquid glass is a bit of a sort of a evolution of Aqua, couldn't you? From the old idea of that having a sort of frosted glass effect and the sort of the feeling that the things like the traffic light were like bubble button kind of things. It's not completely new, is my point. It's not like Microsoft had to come up with the idea and Apple copied it. It's been on Apple Macs for a lot longer, like going back to 2000. So I would say to say it was copying Vista would just invite that question of who was first.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, so I think you're right, it's not new, and that's sort of the problem. Yeah, it's so I wrote an article about this. I'm constantly going to be plugging these, but when Apple launched iOS 7 12 years ago, it was very controversial because it was so different and it was new. It was a design language that wasn't commonplace at that point, and Apple kind of changed the landscape by doing it. I think it also anticipated the way design was going to go, and it was really forward thinking. So when iOS 7 launched, it looked odd, and then within about a year, within 2 years, it just seemed normal. And it didn't seem dated because it took some time to sort of grow into itself. The problem with this is that it's I mean, as Karen has said, it's actually a past trend. It's actually quite a hackneyed approach to design. So they've made this big aesthetic change that's actually something that in some forms has been around for years and years. In this specific form, it is a design trend called glass morphism, which has been around since at least 2020. You see it all around you. I think one of our colleagues said that it reminded him of the Sky Glass artwork at the moment, and from a couple of years ago as well. Actually, though that's still available now. It's a now trend, and that's kind of a problem because it kind of looks comfortable with our current aesthetic, and this is supposed to last us for another 12 years, so it's going to become kind of hackneyed, I think, quicker than iOS 7 did. Aside from that, I do agree with the reader who said that it's hard to read. I should say I haven't used the betas. I very rarely do. I don't trust them. But from what I've seen and from what I've heard, the animations I've seen, it seems like it's really impractical, particularly on iOS 26, because you've got all the stuff going in front of each other, the layers, the transparencies. Then, well, that's going to be putting a lot of burden on the processor and the battery. But also, it becomes busy. It becomes visually busy. So there's things behind that are reading through the thing you're trying to look at, which makes it hard to separate elements on the screen.
Is it the case that the latest beta, so they just updated the beta yesterday, so it's version 2, and hasn't that addressed some of that problem? So I think from what I've seen, that was very much the issue, that people found it really illegible because they could see too much detail before. And I think they've toned down that a bit with the second beta. I think that's one of the things. So like our guy said early on, that Roman mentioned, this is a beta. It's not like this is the final version. Apple will refine and change and make changes and so on. But that said, I think you're really onto something with it being, are people who have vision issues going to struggle with it? It's all very well. They can turn off all the transparencies. They can do all that. If you've got battery life issues and you want to save battery life, you'll probably have the same thing. When you turn your battery onto the mode which preserves battery life, I bet a lot of this stuff will get turned off. But it's like that's designing an interface for people who don't have vision problems and who have plenty of battery life, not an interface for everybody else. And
I think David brings up a good point of about the questioning the longevity of it, because liquid glass is more than just a unifying element. It's supposed to set up Apple's operating systems for the future, whatever that future looks like. I mean that kind of more figuratively than literally looks like. So it's more than just they want to create a unified look, because Apple needs to think about what the operating systems will be doing 10, 15 years from now and what kind of devices we'll be using. So they've created this new design language that they think will carry them forward. But it's hard to see, and excuse the pun, it's hard to see where they're going with liquid glass going forward, because a lot of the inspiration for liquid glass seems to be with Vision OS. And so that makes me wonder, is Vision OS and Vision Pro, is that the platform they feel like is the future? Because, Eddie Q has even said, I think it was during a court appearance, that, 5-10 years from now, we're not going to be using iPhones. We're going to be using some other device, yet we don't know what that device is.
One of the things they said is that they wanted to design, because they're designed in the past for a flat bottom sort of rectangular shape, and now obviously even the iPhone's got curved edges. It's like, is this future product of the future? It's not a square. It's not sort of confined to the angles that you fit those elements into. So yeah, is that it? But that made me think as well, it's like talking about designing for the future. When they designed the iPhone and the Mac interface and everything has to fit in square screens, and then made the screens more curved, that wasn't wasn't a lot of foresight there initially. So they're kind of reacting to that now. What happens if they then decide they want to go for square iPhones again?
Well, it's a good question, and it raises this question of why are they going for consistency? That's because I wrote down in one of my notes for this that what I like about the 26 raft of operating systems is that there's an aesthetic coherence to it all. So you go from iPhone to iPad to Apple Watch to Mac, and you're on a consistent platform, and that's very good for Apple from a marketing point of view, and it makes you feel comfortable using them. But they're different devices, right? The Apple Watch is a fundamentally different device to the iPad and the Mac. You have more space in some areas, and you have more things overlapping in other areas. And Vision Pro is like the ultimate example of this. It's a completely different way of engaging with digital content. And if you're going to design all of these operating systems with that in mind, that only works as if we're moving as a society to virtual reality. But we're not, certainly not instantly. There's going to be a long drawn out process where people are going to be using these operating systems on older devices, possibly square devices, or devices with a variety of screen sizes. And if you try and make too consistent an experience, I don't know if that works when the devices themselves are by their nature not consistent. These are wildly different hardware devices. And I do worry a little bit that they're letting Vision Pro, which, by the way, might not be remotely what replaces the iPhone. It's one of several possibilities that Eddie Q himself didn't even say, oh, it'll be virtual reality. How many is it sold? Hardly any. It's interesting, but I don't know how commercially significant it will ever be. And they're changing everything based on that. So that worries me a little bit.
Yeah, I think that, unifying the operating systems in theory means that someone who's got an iPad who wants a computer can then go and buy a Mac and feel familiar. And I think, like with my dad, for example, that's what happened. He had an iPad, he was used to using that. He had an iPhone, it was like, buy a Mac because you'll be familiar with it. But obviously, like David said, things are different. And yeah, they're going to get a little bit more similar, especially between the iPad and Mac OS with the new version of the operating system. Things like background processing and stuff like that, that's going to be a real game changer. But if people think this is just like they move from a Mac to their iPhone and expect things to work exactly the same way and the interface makes it look the same and it doesn't work quite the same way, then it's just as confusing, isn't it? So, yeah,
that can be misleading.
Yeah, I think it's okay if, we've gotten this far with all the devices in the user interface isn't entirely the same for each device. We've been able to adapt and use them. So I just think it is interesting that there seems to be this belief that they need to set themselves up for the future, which every tech company needs to do that, and trying to draw any inferences from what the current product is and what they think is moving ahead. It's kind of, I don't know if it's really, I don't know if there's really a clear picture. I mentioned Vision Pro. I'm with David. I don't think they believe that that's the future. I think they think that it's possible, but maybe it's a similar device or something like it. But I don't think they think Vision Pro as it is now is the future. It's it'll be different several years from now.
I think also it's not just about unifying the different operating systems, is it? It's supposedly about making the features and the tools we need more visible so that we can easily find what we need. So when we're using the camera, rather than finding out of the 8 or so different options, the option to take a video or the option to take a photo, those will be what are available, which is great. It's a simplification. And then the idea that, they're, rather than it being cluttered. And that reminded me a bit about when the ribbon came to Microsoft Office and everyone absolutely hated it because it suddenly really complicated everything. It was supposed to make things simpler. It was supposed to class types of tools together and everything else, but everyone just couldn't find what they were looking for anymore. And I wonder a little bit if that's going to be part of the problem as well. And it's we've talked about how people who have vision sort of issues might find it difficult to use, but actually normal people will have to relearn a lot of things that they're familiar with right now, and that could be frustrating. So I think, obviously they think we're going to redesign all the interfaces, we're going to make it easier to find the things people want, and hopefully that is the key thing behind it all, I would hope. One thing I thought about is that when I'm using the camera, an issue I have, not just finding the video or the photo, is that I wear glasses. I don't know if you find this too, but you're looking at something in the distance you want to take a picture of, so you're looking for your glasses. You're trying to peer over your glasses at the screen of the iPhone to find what you need. So I do understand why it needs to be simplified, because there are a lot of people who surely have that issue. You can't just whip out your reading glasses or whatever every time you want to. So, simplifying what you see on the interface has to be an important thing. But it's at the same time as simplifying it and making it a little bit more sort of easy to find the specific tab you want to press on or whatever, they've maybe made it a little bit harder to see because of this whole glass effect. So, yeah, can you have both?
Yeah, simplicity is good, but familiarity is maybe better, which is why
That's it.
a lot of the time we end up with a suboptimal design, but it's actually better to stick with it until something a lot better comes along, and then you go, okay, that's worth changing it. But I don't like the ribbon design even now. I hate using Word.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's... I don't use it very often, so maybe I'd get used to it, which I suppose we should try and take into account with all of this, that as the reader said, it's still a beta, so it will change, but also we've not had very long to get used to this sort of thing, and we will probably adapt to it. So it should become easier.
Yeah, that's the thing with all these. Whenever there's a major user interface redesign or cosmetic change or whatever, there's always an uproar, and people don't like change because they're afraid that it will affect how they use their devices. It'll make their devices harder to use. But I think in the end, what happens is people adapt, and it turns out it's not as bad as it feels like it would be at the beginning.
Bit like when we lost the home button and had to learn all the different swipes.
Right. When we lost, there were the hardware changes like the home button and the headphone jack going away and all these other things. And
I spent a year worrying about the home button thing because I didn't. What was the one that I had an iPhone 8 Plus that year, so I didn't get the iPhone 10. I got an iPhone 10s the following year. So the whole year I was thinking, oh, it's going to be rubbish having no home button. And then I got the iPhone 10s within about 2 days. I was just, well, this is obviously easy and probably better. Yeah, so we build these things up in our heads, and it in practice, the brain is quite adaptable.
But
Fingers crossed,
at the end of the day, I think if people have problems with Aqua I don't mean Aqua, do I? Liquid glass, once it comes out, it will be because they suddenly can't find the tools they need. That's what will be the issue. That's what people will complain about. Because by then they'll probably have sorted it out so people can actually see what they're looking at. But will they have the internet right? That's the question.
The issue, I think, maybe is that people who are relatively tech savvy, I'm going to include myself in this, we are willing to experiment and look around for things. But people who are not tech savvy, it's very easy for us to underestimate how scary it is to just do things in an operating system and sort of mess around and look in the menus. I think a lot of people worry that they're going to break something, that they're going to get lost in a menu and not be able to get back out again. The tool has moved to a different menu. Then you or I would think, well, after a few weeks, we've got used to, looking in the help menu or just Googling it, and we'll find where it is and we'll experiment and we'll find it out. But if you are somebody who's only ever owned maybe 2 iPads in your life and don't use them for anything more than just a couple of things, then if there is a major change in the operating system and something you're used to moves, it can be scary trying to get used to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because the people listening to this podcast, they're aware of the changes that are going to happen. They might even be running the beta. But there are a lot of people, and we know those people, who don't even know that their devices update automatically. I know people who don't even update their devices. But for the people who don't even know that they don't update automatically, they're going to wake up one morning and see this new look and be like, what just happened to my iPhone? Who took it over and has this new...
They'll be able to do a virus.
Yeah, it doesn't look like so. Yeah, that's the thing. When you have 1 billion users of a device, a good majority of them, they don't keep track of this stuff like we do. So there's going to be a bit of a shock for a lot of users. But hopefully they'll be able to look beyond that and realize that it's still the same device and the same operating system. It just looks a little differently.
Yeah, I think it's mostly an aesthetic change, isn't it? I've been trying to work out how much they've changed navigationally, and I think there's one very strong example that the workout app on the Apple Watch is really quite different the way you move around it. But most other apps seem to be, they're now transparent, they're now glassy. But other than that, it seems most things are roughly the same. So that's the part that makes me relatively optimistic about it.
Just remember how everyone hated the Photos app this year because they completely redesigned the way it worked, and now nobody can do things the way they always used to do them, and it's frustrating when they do that. And we had stories about how to put it back the way, or get the familiarity back, and we'll no doubt have to write stories about how to make iOS 26 look like iOS 18. I'm sure that will be a popular story. People will want to know how to turn off all those new features, and
Well, the thing is, the Photos app is going to change again. It's getting, a lot simpler. We're going to hear a lot about the app.
They keep simplifying it, and like iMovie, I want the old iMovie version. I want the old Photos version where you could actually do things with them. And now it's all just made so simple that you actually have no flexibility and no ability to do anything. It's like the Photos memories thing, for example. They've just basically they're like, don't worry, we'll do it all for you. What if you want to actually do? It's just so annoying.
Speaking of simplifying, Apple did something, another move to simplify things. They unified the version numbers of its operating systems to reflect the year. So it's now iOS 26, macOS 26, watchOS 26, etc. And in a recent Apple Breakfast column that David likes to plug, and I'll plug for him here, David proposed Apple do the same thing with the iPhone. Paul Petit on Facebook said Apple should just call it Apple OS. It has a common code base, or maybe Apple OS Mac Edition, Apple OS Phone Edition, et cetera, et cetera. What do you guys think about this whole new naming scheme? On the podcast with Mike and Jason, we often gripe about how Apple needs to unify the names, and they finally did that. So we were kind of happy. Now that we know it's going to happen, there's something odd to me about calling it the year. I don't know what it is. Maybe because it's new and I haven't settled into it yet. It has that uncomfortable new feeling. But yeah, it just feels weird for me to call it macOS 26 and iOS 26.
It's
for
a
some
big
reason.
number, isn't it? There was a time when iOS 3, and now we're like, and then we were at 18, and suddenly 26 just seems like a really big number.
Part of it is the big number. Part of it also is because I know it represents a year. It seems odd to me to equate that to a version number. Maybe it's just because I'm too old school in that way, in terms of having dealt with all these technology and software and stuff like that. And I'm so used to a certain nomenclature.
Apple has done it before, though, haven't they? There was iLife 09 and that whole suite of them. So they have done it before.
Yeah, but Office, Microsoft is Office 20 whatever, isn't it? They're always going by the year.
Yeah.
But to David's point in his column, and because I also know in the back of my head, Apple has these hardware devices. The only ones that they identify by number are the iPhones. The Mac and iPads. They're not identified by. In their Apple's catalog, they do refer to them by year, but it's mostly a parenthetical, and it's not you won't see it on the website and stuff. But maybe if you were in an Apple store, you would see it in a list that way. But yeah.
If you look on the sort of comparison tool on Apple's website, you'll see everything's listed by processor. So you've got MacBook Air M4, MacBook Pro, M4 Pro, Mac Mini, M4 Pro, whatever. The same with the iPad. So almost you could unify the iPhone and have it with the processor, which might be meaningless to people, but you know there's a difference between the iPhone A16 and the iPhone A18. But, because when you start talking about years, I feel like it gets a little bit more complicated with iPhones, because the iPhone 15 Pro is almost on par with the iPhone 16, but the year would kind of make it look like there was a bigger gap there. So I feel like if you use the processor name, and given that they've got the processor names and they've got this sort of unified method for sort of numbering them, it makes more sense to use the processor. So I feel like, we could be talking about the iPhone 19, A19 or something like that. But
I think the issue is that different parts of the naming would be useful for different people. So, as you say, some people would not know what M2 processor means at all, and they would see, particularly when you get the cutoff between two systems where they're comparing an A18 processor to an M1 processor, and they wouldn't have any real way of comparing them, just like Intel to M1. The year thing is not perfect, of course, but it seems to me to be the most informative method to use for the people that need it most, which is people that don't really have any starting knowledge of the market and the history of the iPhone. I do think you would still need to say Pro or something. Like I've always campaigned for Apple to reduce the number of words in the names. I think it's getting ridiculous, but I think if you could just get to the level of, this is the iPhone 2025, this is the iPhone Pro 2025, that seems informative and fairly simple for non-techie people. Although you would still have issues with there are some 2025 phones that are more powerful than some 2026 phones, and there would be some complications, but you'd have the word Pro in there to help with that. So when I wrote this article that Roman kindly plugged for me, I worked on the basis that they won't do another E, which maybe is mad, but I think they only did the E so that they could have an Apple Intelligence ready budget phone. But from now on, I think they can just say, well, you can get an older model if you want a cheaper phone. I think now that they've cleared the Apple Intelligence hurdle, they will be less keen to roll out an E model. So having the year in there, and by the way, can I go on record now and say it really annoys me that it's 26 and not 25? Because this reminds me of the bad old days of print magazines when we would write April 21 on the cover of a magazine that went on sale in January, just because you didn't want to seem old.
It'll be mid-September by the time it comes out, so it will really only be like 3 months or whatever.
Mid-September of which year, Karen?
2025,
I think it should be the year it launches, but I get why they're doing it, because they want it to seem, they're doing exactly what we used to do with magazines. They're trying to make it seem as new as possible, but I think the reason the change is good is because it's more informative, and to be as informative as possible, you should make it the year it came out. That's my rant.
I was thinking, like, in comparison to other smartphones, you've got like Samsung's Galaxy S25, so I guess they're calling their phones after the year. And then it becomes a race to be the first one to get out the 2026 model, doesn't it? Because suddenly they're being compared based on what year they are, where people wouldn't necessarily know what OnePlus was the latest model, or what sort of Google Pixel was the latest one. But if you've got the year in them and they all do that, then you know where you are, don't you?
It never even occurred to me that the S25, the 25 meant 2025.
I assume it does. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe it's a coincidence.
Yeah, I believe you.
The issue with naming products based on the year, you kind of have to stick to an annual release schedule, because you can't have, for instance, if you had a iPhone 26 that's coming out this year, and you decided you were going to skip a year release, then you go into 2027 with you go into 20. See, this is all confusing because it's called 2026 that's released in 2025. So, but anyway, you end up with a name that gets the name ages because it's based on the year now. So the name ages as well. When it was a version number, it was kind of amorphous. You don't really know what it means. People don't really know what it means. I don't even know what they mean a lot of times when people tell me, I have an iPhone 12 and iPhone 12.
There's like a rumor, I think, isn't there, that the iPhone 19 or 20, whatever we're talking about, like not this year but next year, or maybe the year after, that they'll bring out the iPhone model in the following, like, February or March. Like, then you get even more confused if you're calling it by the year, because it looks like it's the same year. Yeah, I mean, if they don't bring it out in the September, if they don't bring them all out at the same time, then having the same name, as in the same year name, doesn't really answer any questions about which phone's better than the other. I mean, obviously you've still got the Pro and the Plus but then, like, Plus and Max don't say anything really, do they? That's just a bigger version. and then call it. That's the other thing I was thinking about. Using Max for M4 Max, like, and also having Max meaning bigger for the bigger version of the iPhone Pro, I think is just using the same word Max to mean two completely different things. So
Yeah,
I think Apple needs to tidy that up a bit as well.
Also, Max has to be the best. You can't have something be Max and then go, and Ultra. Max means the maximum. You can't do that. Oh, it winds me up. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The problem is that the phones that were going to come out the following spring were going to be the cheaper ones anyway. So that's really going to be a problem if you've got the iPhone 25 Pro and then the next spring you get the iPhone 26, which is going to be a weaker phone, but it'll have 26 in it. So that would be a problem.
Yeah, you still call it like that year, but it looks to anyone buying one, they don't necessarily know that it came out later.
Well, I guess the thing to remember about all this is that, I mean, the names are basically how Apple wants to define them. So if a phone does come out in 26, they can just decide we'll call it 26.
One reason why Apple might want to do it, it shames people, because if you're using an iPhone 11, you don't feel so bad. It's an iPhone 11. If you're using an iPhone 2019, then you feel like you've got an antique. Maybe
That
people
is funny, yeah. Right. That is true, because like I said before, when people, like somebody will tell me I have an iPhone 12, there have been so many, there's so many products that we keep track of. I can't remember what year it came out. But now I'll know what year it came out, and I'll think, wow, you're using a 7-year-old phone.
Yeah. So it's in Apple's interest. It's in Apple's interest to shame people into thinking they're using old phones.
But it would also shame resellers, and this is a better reason, because we always see people trying to big up a deal. Well, they'll say brand new iPhone 16 and sort of try and imply it's newer than it really is. But if they have to put iPhone 2025 in, they're selling it in 2028, they can't get around the fact that it's old. I mean, that's not that old, but you know what I mean.
I didn't realize that was the ulterior motive, that they to sell more phones.
We've worked it out. We've figured it out.
Well, on that note, that does it for this episode of the Macworld Podcast, episode 940. Thanks to Karen Haslam. Thanks to David Price. And thanks to you, the audience. Thank you for tuning in. You can subscribe to the Macworld Podcast in the podcast app, on Spotify, on YouTube at the Macworld Podcast channel, or through any other podcast app. Do you have any comments or questions? Contact us through Blue Sky, Facebook, or Threads. Just search for Macworld and look for the blue mouse logo. Join us in the next episode of the Macworld Podcast as we talk about the latest in the world of Apple. See you next time.
I've never been on TikTok. What do they say on TikTok? Don't they do dances?
Yeah, that's what we should do.
That would be a new one.
Aren't we supposed to change one of us changes into a cat or something by accident? Isn't that
something like that? Yes.